friends, this week's book is brought to us by Macmillan Publisher, and it's Cranberry Thanksgiving by Wende and Harry Devlin. So it's Thanksgiving this week. I'm going to talk later this week in another video about the story that we always learn about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans and how that might not be totally true. And instead of doing a book all about turkeys and Squanto and pilgrims, I'm going to read us something a little different, which I really like. And this book is sort of a cool New England mystery set at Thanksgiving dinner, all about Grandma's secret recipe for cranberry bread. So let's start the book, and I hope you like it. Cranberry Thanksgiving. And it's written by Wende and Harry Devlin. And here we see the portraits of the characters in our Thanksgiving mystery story. Cranberry Thanksgiving. And here we see Grandma cooking something with cranberries. Maggie darted about like a black stockinged bird in search of wood for the fireplace. So where do we see Maggie? She's out over there gathering wood. She and her grandmother lived at the edge of a lonely cranberry bog in New England, and the winds were cold at the edge of the sea. So they live near a cranberry bog where they grow cranberries. It's a cranberry Thanksgiving. Today, Mr. Whiskers was helping Maggie with her chores, and they soon had armfuls of firewood. So there's Mr. Whiskers, the second character in our mystery. Happy Thanksgiving Day, Mr. Whiskers, Maggie smiled at her friend. That wasn't his real name, of course. It was Uriah Peabody. But Maggie had called him Mr. Whiskers ever since she could remember. Maggie was very fond of Mr. Whiskers. Her grandmother was not. Too many whiskers and not enough soap, she often said to Maggie. So Grandma thinks that Mr. Whiskers is not very clean. He needs to use more soap. Mr. Whiskers, indeed, sniffed Grandmother, peeking from her kitchen window. She pulled the curtains tight again. Whenever Grandmother baked her cranberry bread, she pulled her curtains tight. The reason for this was her cranberry bread was the most famous for miles around. So why does she close the curtains when she bakes her secret recipe? Because it's secret. Grandma scoffed at the whole idea. Still, she felt it was something wonderful to leave to Maggie. So she wants to save her recipe so she can give it to her granddaughter. She carefully hid the recipe behind a brick in the fireplace. Oh, a lot of people would like to get this recipe, she fumed to herself. Especially Maggie's clam-digging friend, Mr. Whiskers. Strange how he always showed up when she took down the great yellow bowl and all the good things that went into it. So anytime she makes cranberry bread, Mr. Whiskers shows up. Scout! Shoo! She would call out to the window every time he came close to the house. Is that a nice way to talk to your neighbors? I don't think so. But forget all that today. It was Thanksgiving, her favorite day of the year. The cranberries had been picked, boxed, and sent to the market. The dried corn had been soaked and the corn pudding made. The turkey was roasting in the old iron oven. Turnips, tiny green peas, and a pumpkin pie were ready. The cranberry bread was cooling on the window board. The real work was done, and the feast was almost ready. Every year, Grandmother invited a guest for dinner and allowed Maggie to do the same. So they're each allowed to invite one guest. So if Maggie and Grandma each invite one guest each, that's 4 people at Thanksgiving dinner. Ask someone poor or lonely, she always said. It never mattered to Maggie or her grandmother that the red carpet was worn and mended, or that the silver spoons didn't match. Friendship and sharing were important, but everyone knew that. Red-cheeked Maggie raced into the house. While she changed, Grandmother excitedly told her whom she had invited. Mr. Horace was his name, and he was staying at the town hotel. He actually bows, and he has a gold cane and smells of lavender, said Grandmother happily, and he's all alone. Maggie looked a little uncertain. My guest doesn't smell of lavender, she began. And he hasn't had a Thanksgiving dinner in 20 years. Oh, no. I invited Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers? Grandmother didn't appear to believe she had heard right. You mean here, in the house? But now there was a sound at the door and a loud clanging of the knocker. Quick, Grandmother, take off your apron. Grandmother opened the door, and there they were, both guests, Mr. Horace, pink-cheeked and starched, and Mr. Whiskers, in his captain's hat. As they came in, trailing behind was the smell of lavender and an aura of clams and seaweed. So lavender from Mr. Horace, and clams and seaweed from Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers had held up his hands to Grandmother. Clean, he said. Oh, and where is your tie? Grandmother asked. He lifted his long whiskers. Right here where it's always been, he growled. So he's always wearing a tie. It's just covered by his long beard. Maggie thought she saw a smile behind the whiskers. Humph, said Grandmother, and taking Mr. Horace's arm, she led them into the dining room. So she grabbed Mr. Horace's arm, and they're headed inside. A log fire sputtered. The glasses shone, and certainly no one would have noticed that the silver spoons didn't match. Let's sing We Gather Round Together, said Maggie, trying to warm things up. They all joined in the old hymn, and midway began to sing out with cheer and gusto. So when we sing with gusto, we have a lot of spirit and enthusiasm. Grandmother started to trill like a bird until Mr. Whiskers fixed her with a quizzical gaze. Like this, and shook his ears. When you shake your ears, you go like this. He doesn't like her singing very much. How about 16 men on a dead man's chest? He roared, slapping his knee. So that's an old sailor's song. Mr. Horace looked pained. Grandmother peered over her glasses. Really? She said. Maggie left the table and reappeared with the roast turkey. The corn pudding, peas, cranberry jelly, and turnips soon followed. And then came pale sweet butter and Grandmother's famous cranberry bread. Feast of feasts, murmured Mr. Whiskers. So he is very pleased with the food. Well, we have all heard about your cranberry bread, chuckled Mr. Horace, and the recipe hidden in the kitchen fireplace. It's in the dining room fireplace, said Grandmother, and looking over at Mr. Whiskers, she added, and you, sir, will never find it. Mr. Whiskers stared at the turkey and pretended not to have heard her. So Mr. Horace is talking about Grandma's secret recipe in the kitchen fireplace, and she says, no, it's in the dining room fireplace, and Mr. Whiskers, that scoundrel, will never get it. Maggie began to get nervous, but she made sure everyone was served some of each dish, and they began to eat. What a great full dinner that was, with everything cooked with crisp edges and tender centers. How delicious, said Maggie. How exquisite, said Mr. Horace. How about some more, said Mr. Whiskers. So when you hold out your plate like that, you're saying, hey, give me some more food. At last they finished dinner, and Maggie and Grandmother cleared the table and went into the kitchen. Watch that Mr. Whiskers fellow, Grandma whispered to Maggie. Maggie opened the kitchen door just a small bit and peeked into the dining room. Her eyes widened. Grandmother, he's found it! What could she mean by it? What did they find? The secret recipe. Crash! Clumpity! So stomp your feet. There's a whole lot of noise because Mr. Horace and Mr. Whiskers are chasing each other around. There was a sound of wild scuffling, loud shouts, and falling chairs. Two figures pushed to the front door. For a moment they wrestled at the doorway and then seemed to burst into the purple dusk. One chased the other into the cranberry bog. So they ran all the way into the bog where the cranberries grow in the water. The nerve of him stealing our recipe, said Grandmother with fire in her eyes. So she's angry. Maggie knew whom she meant. It wasn't Mr. Whiskers, she said. It was Mr. Horace. Mr. Horace? Grandmother looked shocked. But why? Because he owns a bakery in the city. And Mr. Whiskers knew this? Grandmother asked. Yes, said Maggie. Mr. Whiskers kindly came today to watch Mr. Horace and to have dinner. Mr. Whiskers came puffing up to the door, holding Mr. Horace by the collar. Proudly, he held the recipe high in the other hand. Don't trust a man because he smells of lavender and has a gold cane, he growled. So he's saying, maybe you've heard the phrase, don't judge a book by its cover. Grandma thinks Mr. Whiskers is smelly and dirty, so he must be a bad person. And Mr. Horace, he seems wealthy and smells good, so he must be nice. But that's not how people are. We have to see what's in their hearts. And Thanksgiving, we welcome people into our hearts and homes. Now, a little fewer people this year because of coronavirus, but we still want to open our hearts to everyone. Grandmother stood up very straight and looked hard at Mr. Horace. You, sir, she said, are a disgrace. He is worse than that, said Mr. Whiskers. He's a recipe robber, said Maggie. All the starch seemed to leave Mr. Horace. So before he was starched, and now he's sagging because he's been caught robbing the recipe. No pumpkin pie for you, sir, said Grandmother, handing him his cane. Mr. Horace began to sniffle. They left Mr. Horace on the doorstep. Grandmother closed the door firmly, and this time she took Mr. Whiskers' arm into the dining room. Maggie thought she could see Mr. Whiskers smile. So Grandma is holding Mr. Whiskers' arm now that Mr. Horace has been kicked out. They sat by the warm embers of the fire and ate pumpkin pie with whipped cream. How delicious, said Maggie. Look how cozy they are in front of the fire. "How delightful," said Grandmother. "How about another piece?" said Mr. Whiskers. The wind rattled the shutters, and outside the door came a loud wail from Mr. Horace. "Ooh, ooh, ooh." "Goodness, is he still there?" said Maggie. "Shall we let him in? It is Thanksgiving," said Grandmother. "It's especially Thanksgiving on a cranberry farm," Maggie replied encouragingly. They looked at Mr. Whiskers. It took great effort on Mr. Whiskers' part. With true character, he stood up and said, "Maggie, open the door, and we shall give him the last piece." So they're so grateful for what they have, they decide to forgive Mr. Horace and share their pumpkin pie with him. Now Grandma says, "How about 16 men on a dead man's chest?" Grandmother asked him, the old sailor song he wanted to sing. While Maggie went to the door, and even his whiskers couldn't hide that smile. The end. So this story is sort of a festive, fun mystery. I thought it would be fun to have something a little different on Thanksgiving because I've personally had enough stories with pilgrims and turkeys, and this story really just celebrates what we can celebrate every day, which is being grateful for what we have, enjoying the beautiful fall, and sharing what we have with others. So at the end of the book, we have a recipe for Grandma's secret cranberry bread. So if you get a Go Pack at the Northeast Branch Library this week, I have almost everything you'll need to make that recipe, including a copy of the recipe. So all you'll need in addition to the Go Pack is 1 egg and either some butter or some oil. See you in the kitchen.